Okay, well, so let's start there. I would love for you to tell me a little bit about one of your plant breeding projects that you are passionate about or proud of or happy with its progress so far.
Yeah, one of the plant breeding projects that I get a lot of joy out of, which I think is really key because there's a lot of work involved in plant breeding, and if you're not getting joy out of the process, it is very easy to abandon a project. So, working with crops that you enjoy and the process that you enjoy is really important. So, one of the crops that I really enjoy working with is sweet corn,
Oh.
because the process is really interesting and there's a lot of challenges. The wildlife in my area is very persistent. And one of the things you find as you breed things that are tasty, they discover that you have something more tasty than, say, the other person's corn patch down the street. And you have to figure out a way to protect this project because every iteration and maybe even the seed itself is precious. Because I'm working in our region. I'm on the basically right at the 45th parallel. I'm located in central Maine in zone USDA for zone 4B. So I get pretty consistently 20 below zero F here in the wintertime, or can. I mean, we can get 40 below zero F occasionally, but 20 below zero F is something we expect. And we have a fairly short season. So sometimes our frost is at the end of May, our last frost, and our first frost can be as early as, around the equinox in September, or but it could also be the middle of October. It kind of depends on the season. So in that cycle also we have cooler springs and cooler falls. So it is not, it's not obviously 85 and 90 degrees all the way through that, from start
Mm.
to go. So we have a lot of fluctuating rain and a lot of fluctuating dry spells and cold and nights and hot days and all kinds of funny things, which is really fun to like work with plants and particularly corn um, in. So that process for me that's been really fun is figuring out how to select in generations. And
Mm.
I'll explain the technique that I use, which is um, I pretty much only work when I select for plants, whether I'm doing a sort of variety maintenance project with a new variety, with a current variety that exists, rare or whatever, or if I'm
Mhm.
working on a breeding project, I select for plants that have 2 ears on the plant. And there's a reason for this. Part of it is that the first year often is um, will be clear of any potential genetic contamination from GE corn, because it silks early. Okay, so in general, GE corn here is dent corn. And dent corn in the north, in my region, is not really adapted to this region. To be truthful, it's harder to make grain corn and a dent corn here. So that type of corn tassels quite a bit later than, say, sweet corn or flint corn for the most part. I would be kind of pressing my luck if I was trying to grow a dent corn here as seed because of the overlap. But sweet corn has a fairly early tasseling and silking habit for those first ears, particularly. So those ears are almost entirely clean of, any outcrossing beyond what's in that patch. Um, and then the second ear may or may not be. It kind of depends on the variety. But I've learned to use the second ear as a judge of whether the first ear has the correct quality. So in many varieties, the second ear is slightly smaller, but is almost an exact clone of the first ear. And so when I'm evaluating the sweet corn plot, first I'm looking for, plants with 2 ears because I feel like that's, efficient use of nutrients and I should expect that. Single ear plants can often be very large, huge ears, actually. Sometimes a single ear plant can have one big ear, and I call those kind of unicorn plants because they're really long horns that come off the plant, and they're really seductive, but it's really hard to select for quality because you basically would have to break that ear at milk stage and then hope that the rest of the kernels wouldn't rot after having broken the kernel the cob. So if a sweet
Right.
corn, I'd have to break it and chew it. And then I'm sort of risking another 2 months of dry down, or at least a month of dry down before I can really harvest it. And I find that to be not a good idea. But also, I just love the idea in organic systems that, we should have efficient nutrient use, and that organic 2 years reflects that. Um, so the second year is often an exact copy of the first year, so that if the second year has not tip fill, so if it's like, it hasn't filled all the way out,
Yeah.
you'll often see the same thing in the first year. So it's like basically, or if that ear is sort of thick and has, whatever, the first year is exactly the same. They basically have like the same number of rows. They basically have like, if the rows are irregular, it means the first run is irregular. And so this again, there's no like hard set rules, because you'll find varieties that don't abide by this, and you have to create, which is really the fun part, is creating another matrix by where you make that decision. So but and I'll stick with this one where it works, where basically I'm able to judge the quality, the eating quality of the first year, even though it's gone by
Mhm.
the eating quality and the rows and pest resistance, et cetera, of the second year. And
Right.
then I'm basically using the first year of the sweet corn as my seed, which gives
Mhm.
me quite a bit of a longer period of time. And I'm pulling off all these second years for personal enjoyment. And in general, if there's plants that I decide that I'm not going to keep the first year on, oftentimes by the time the second year is ready, those might have gone over a little bit, but oftentimes they're still good for like canning or freezing. They're not necessarily gotten gummy. So that kind of
Okay.
correspondence of like a week or two between the first or second year, sometimes those first years are, not in use and can be fed to animals, or the ones that I select against, the rogue out, or, whatever. But basically I have all these second years to eat. So even though, and so in that case, what I end up doing is I then put a yellow mesh bulb bag. So you get bulbs in a wholesale manner from, or you may even see these in the hardware store. There's like these yellow, really fine mesh plastic bags. And I find that these are great to pull over that ear and do a little cinching. And it basically protects the ear from any kind of bird or squirrel for the most part. We've had some issues where the crows have learned to tear apart those bags a little bit, and it just kind of depends. Like they'll get one or two, and they can't quite get into the other, so it's more hit or miss, and I just adjust the bag. Um, but for the most part, that's been our way of keeping the sweet corn in the field all the way through. So part of what I'm doing is when I pull that second ear, I pull the ear, and if the stalk breaks, that's no good because the stalk wasn't strong enough. So I want a
Oh,
strong stalk, which tells
right.
me if I shouldn't have to hold on to the plant to pull the ear off. Now I can, but regardless, you want to be able to say this has a good sturdy plant. So just the harvesting process tells you something.
Right.
So if that plant breaks, even if the ear is yummy, you're basically bringing in weaker genetics. The next part of this for me is like there's always the flavor, the taste, the rose, blah, blah, blah. Those are all really, oh, does this taste good? The next part of this to me is actually the seed quality through this when it actually gets done to ripening.
Mhm.
And so what I want is a variety that not only produces excellent ears for eating, but I want a variety that can basically almost fully dry down in the field in my season. So I want sweet corn that has high seed quality. And in the seed trade, they'll call that producibility. So it doesn't mean producibility in the produce market. It means producibility in the seed.
Right.
Because there's a lot of varieties of sweet corn, hybrid or otherwise, that you can grow, but the seed will not dry down in the field, and you'll have to bring it in and basically put it in a heated room, or it'll mold because of our dewy seasons. So I'm selecting for a plant that has a great yield of at least 2 years, with really good quality, with a strong plant, and that at the end of the season, when I looked at the corn yesterday, the sweet corn's still in the field. It's October 2nd today, I
Mhm.
think. So we just looked at one batch of sweet corn, and we're still going to leave it in for another week. I usually leave it all the way up to frost as long as I can. Um, and it's doing just fine. Now, when I first started selecting it, there was more mold, and I've selected away towards, I throw those out. Any dried down seed corn ear that has mold, I just throw it out. Or I just give it away or whatever.
Sure.
I don't save it for seed for the next generation. And so that has yielded plants that have really good seed quality and disease resistance. So there's a lot of things that we think we're doing when we're like salvaging a crop. We're like, oh, I got to get this crop, and geez, it's starting to mold. For me, the sign that something is molding, yes, there's extreme years, and I think that's a different story. But
Mm,
like recognizing that all the stages of seed and seed production are important to basically making selections off of. So when I go to that final year and there's either something wrong with the year or it's been compromised by diseases or it appears to be eaten by bugs, there's bugs going on. There's years right next to it that are not eaten by bugs.
yeah.
So that year that got eaten by bugs goes away, and we have to be willing. Part of plant breeding is this willingness to be observant of all these different stages in the plant's life. You can do a lot of selection just based upon seedling vigor in the tray of seedlings, or seedling vigor in terms of direct seeding. So you can do a lot of selection in that space. Out of what we're at right now with sort of the fourth or so generation of this plant breeding project, now I have stocks that do not blow over because of that whole thing of not only do the stocks have to stand up when I'm doing the harvesting, they have to stand up all the way through the ear ripening. Anything that falls over or gets bent, even if I have a seed ear on it, it doesn't go forward. So now I have these ears that you're like, these stalks that you're like, these are really strong.
Yeah.
By the way, that's my friend Donna who works with me, and she is doing some seed drying in we have this drying room. So we're working on that too. So this observant of these different overlapping parts of the plant is how you make progress. If you're just focused on flavor,
Mm,
you're going to get somewhere, but you're going to probably bring in a lot of other traits. And sometimes this means that you have a patch and you have 500 plants and you're only taking out 30 good ears or maybe 10 good ears. Because I think some folks get a little bit caught up in the selection part of this and they hear something where you need X number of plants for the next generation. What it means is you needed to have a population that crossed into those potential 10 plants. And then the next generation, you want to grow another 500, and so it's not about whether you take 500 ears out. It's about whether you have appropriate population to do the selection from. So it's harder if, say, you only have 20 plants and you're doing a selection. This is also one of the hurdles in plant breeding is number of plants. So
yeah.
your ability to see what's going on, and corn in particular kind of requires a large garden plot of corn, in my opinion, to make a reasonable assessment of the population, whether this is variety maintenance or plant breeding. I want to see 300 to 500 plants at their best because I want to be able to evaluate the population. If I only had 50 plants, now you sometimes you have to do that when that's all you have. You have
Yeah.
50 plants, you got to start there. But that's all just stop there because there's more weeds to get into. But that's just my favorite project is one of my favorite projects is sweet corn because of the length of season and seeing all these different stages and how really we've seen amazing progress in basically positive selection versus negative selection, the things we don't want versus the things we've chosen. It shows itself really clearly.
Beautiful. Um, what do you think of? So you chatted a little bit about all of the variabilities in our climate, for example, in the, for you, Northeast United States, for us, Atlantic Canada, very similar in that way. What do you think the rationale or importance or extra challenge is for growers in our regions to engage in plant breeding work?
Well, so the corn I talked about is a super sweet corn, actually. and it's not your traditional corn. It's a very sweet, super sweet, plus lots of flavor. And what I found is that varieties that I like disappear because they're not breeding for my climate. So there's hybrids that I really enjoy, and then they've replaced them with something else, and that quote new thing is nowhere near as good for me in my latitude as the variety they dropped.
Mhm.
So that puts me in a position of like basically constantly scrambling for a variety, for finding the new variety, because their predication is not, they weren't really even breeding that first variety. It was just lucked out that it was for me. They weren't breeding it for my environment. It just happened to be that I was like, oh, this is the good one. And then, 5 years later or even less, sometimes by the time I find it, they get rid of it. So um, that for the sweet corn part of it is there's an ever evolving portfolio of hybrids, and we don't have any say in that and what's valuable. And varieties come and go for reasons that have nothing to do with whether they perform for us. So that put me in a position of wanting to take the varieties that I either had remnant seed of or that were still in the marketplace that I was worried were going to go away and start breeding with those and to capture those traits for myself and to basically be able to say, I consistently have this corn that's awesome for me. And in some ways, it could also give you the ability, if you want to, if you're still looking for new varieties that are yummy, you can create a little bit more of a population model where you're folding in those new varieties into your population. So you could be iterating additionally beyond trying to get, quote, a finished variety. It's sort of that's sort of an extension of like, what does breeding mean? What's your goals? But for me, the goals are really like adapted varieties that I can consistently produce seed of. Because even in some of the open pollinated stuff, which I have looked at some of the open pollinated super sweet corns that exist currently, they don't produce seed here in my area consistently. So their quality isn't necessarily poor on the cob, although I think they've been bred more for tropical environments. So there's some tropical gene super sweets, and they get to be, 10 feet tall and produce ears very late. And that causes problems because if I was going to save from that, it crosses with that dent corn that I was talking about. So
Yeah.
these things matter to me to not chase my tail and chase varieties. And the disease resistance of varieties that have been selected in our region really does matter. We get a lot more heat and humidity, and particularly the humidity and damp falls, and having good strong, sturdy corn that can handle winds and also wet, windy conditions because we get these, storms that come through, hurricanes in August and September, are really important. And they're not really worried about that if they're breeding for, and just so everyone knows what they are breeding for, they're breeding for single pick varieties. What that means is a variety that they don't care if it has a second ear.
Right.
They only care that it has one good ear, and they strip pick the whole field, either mechanically or by hand. And they're breeding for folks that are selling mostly out of Georgia and Florida. So primarily those Georgia and Florida, Florida predominantly is the place where early sweet corn is produced. That's where the corn that shows up in your marketplace that's wrapped in plastic and little trays comes from.
Mhm.
So that's a huge market for the sweet corn. And basically they're only breeding early corn for the most part. So 76 days is kind of like their target or less. So a 78 or an 80 or an 85-day corn, they don't really breed much of that anymore. Late corn is not really a thing, because folks are basically taking those varieties and successively planting those same 76-day varieties every week. Um, so there's like the environment that they're working for, the diseases that they're predicated upon, the fertilizer that's being used primarily. So I'm looking for a plant that can do well in a relative organic system, um, herbicide, et cetera. So, you continue to chase your tail more
Hmm.
as the breeding companies breed not for you. And the contrast of that is that a lot of sweet corn used to be bred for the Northeast and in the Northeast. So Asgrow Seed Company used to be based in the Northeast and then was based in Michigan. And there's also a place that was called Robeson Seeds, which is not the same company, but there's kind of a related, somewhat related company called Seneca Vegetable Seed that is still in New York. It's actually located in Hall, New York, which is next to Robeson, New York, where the Robeson Seed Company was, or Robeson Road. And they still breed sweet corn, but they are also selling to all these other markets. And so those folks that are breeding sweet corn still in our region, like Seneca Vegetable Seed, that's where I might find stuff that's still awesome to start with.
Right.
But that element of like who they're trying to serve and who their customer base is, the roadside farm market is like a very small portion of who they're trying to provide seed to. So that's probably like, I don't know, I'm just gonna say it's a fifth or an eighth of their seed sales. And so they're trying to basically sell to all these other large scale producers that are doing the strip pick method. And if that's your game, then they've got something for you. But for me, I prefer a patch that I can go out to and pick successive multiple ears off of plants over the course of a couple of weeks. And Blake says, what's the point of putting the effort into protecting all my corn from raccoons to just pick it once? So this is kind of the element of like, what are we up against? We're up against the fact that we're not the target audience, particularly in the Northeast and Atlantic Canada.
Yeah, for sure. What would you what guidance would you offer to a seed grower who has maybe identified a gap in the available seed, for what they need and would like to get into plant breeding, but hasn't done any of that specifically yet? How would you, do you have any advice for that grower?
Yeah, I mean, that's where I started. I mean, I think plant breeding is often, when I say to folks, it's often that you're growing some things and you ask yourself, what would happen if I crossed my two best things? These my two favorites, and that could be a field performance favorite with a flavor performance favorite, whatever it is. We sort of say, geez, if I could just combine these two things or somehow, I would get something that could be cool. The challenge is, I think I've sort of talked a little bit about this, is one, um, plant population. So, if you cross two squash, you want to grow enough plants that you could see what the evidence of that was.
Mm.
And so it's a little different of saying, I got 5 plants of this and 5 plants of that, and I crossed them. Well, you probably would like to look at, you know, 20 to 100 plants to sort of see what's going on. And that's harder for a gardener to do because it can eat up all your space, um, and mess with your rotations. But what I found on a market garden level is I was really pretty able to sell a lot of the mix. So if I was in market gardening mode, I was able to sell the mix as like a breeding mix or a fun mix and tell people what it was. And that's somewhat based upon the fact that I'm not really into this proprietary element where I'm not really caring if somebody else saves seed from the thing that I was playing with. So people are like, ooh, cool colors and interesting flavors. So they're basically getting like in a box of squash, they're getting like 6 different types of squash rather than one, which for some people is fun. And you just tell them we're doing this thing and it's a cross between this and that. And find particularly CSA customers are pretty into it. Um, because if you're starting with two tasty things, usually the result is mostly tasty things. You can't say for sure, but and you can even enlist your CSA customers and be like, bring back seed of one that was really tasty.
Hmm.
It could be the next generation. Or bring me a piece of one that and the seed of one that you thought was really yummy, and I'll taste it, and we might save that seed. So you can engage people in the process, and whether that's at the farmers market, you could have like a little, you know, whatever free thing for people that join you in your little process. I mean, there's challenges in all this. I'm not pretending, but again, I haven't had an issue marketing the diversity out of most of this stuff. Now, tomatoes can be a little funny because sometimes there are some bad tomatoes that come out of the process and you have to be a little more discerning. but you can taste those fruits before you start selling them at the market. So sometimes it's cool. I know some folks down in Massachusetts at this crab apple farm where basically their tomatoes that they sell at market are all their own breeding projects that are ongoing. And so, they have their cherry tomato mix is all these different varieties that they're playing with. And their goal isn't necessarily to have like a uniform thing. Their goal is like a population that remains tasty, and they just are selecting these raw lines for taste and performance. And I really see it. Their lines are really healthy, very, very disease resistant. And some of the plants are really, really good, and some of the plants are like the average person would be like, this is good. So it's almost like what you might think is not so good. Most people are like, this is good. So there's sort of this element of that. So that's the biggest issue is like, how do I deal with the population? And isn't there value? How do I deal with the extra number of plants or fruits that result or whatever it is that comes out of having all of this excess to select from? So, you have to have space and then an outlet for all that diversity. And then you kind of have to decide what your breeding objectives are. The third challenge is, and what I mean by objectives is not necessarily like I want a green thing that does this, because the truth is what you really should be looking for is the best thing that comes out of the cross, that, the best population. Because the thing that has the traits that like it looks green, it's a green squash that does, well, it could be awful, but there's this other thing that's really good. And like, what are you going to do? Play with this thing that's awful just because you wanted a certain color? That's silly. So of course you're going to choose the thing that's really good. But the challenge here is what are the techniques that you're going to use to capture that Polaroid? And what I mean by that's like every season in a breeding process, you have a plant and it has certain traits, and you're trying to find the good ones. And what is your approach to say, that's my snapshot? And and whatever I'm doing here is going to help me move forward with maybe a better population. With some plants, you can use things like hand pollination or bagging flowers or things if it's a self-pollinating plant. But even if you're not doing that type of work where you're intervening in the pollination process, it's important. And this is where the land space thing is important. Sometimes it's fine in the first generation to be like, hey, this is the one that tastes good. And you just like have your squash and they're just all like running into each other and you can't really figure out where it came from. But you know that that one's pretty and or that one tastes good. And sometimes that's enough in the first generation or two. But when you get into like the second or third generation or fourth generation, you really want to know the traits of each plant in the population. And so that means tracing back to the mother root plant, transplant or whatever seedling, all of the fruits that come from that plant and bringing them forward. Because you might find one that's good, but then the other ones might be small and misshapen. Or it might be a plant that's produced two good fruits, and there's another one over here that has like six or eight that are all equally good. And you can't discern that if they're just running into each other, or that if you're not taking the time to trace them all back. So even in a mass population model, you might find yourself needing to plant the plants farther apart. So in our model with squash, we've discovered that 6 feet apart in the row, and then quite a bit of space between the plants in between rows, I mean,
Mhm.
is helps us see what's going on. What's the difference between, for an example, a butternut that tastes good that has 22 fruits per plant, and what's the difference between one that tastes good that has 9 fruits per plant? And when you see the value of bringing forward the one that tastes good that has 22 fruits, um, I wouldn't know that if they were all running into each other. I would just know, geez, it seems like this area things are populous in this part of the field, but I don't really know which plant it came off of.
Mm.
So in open population stuff, you know the fruiting parent. In other words, if it's a fruit, you know that the pollen can, that the fruit is on this vine. You don't know who the pollen parent is. So you know half the parentage, and so every year you're sort of selecting for half. if you're just doing open pollinated work. And that's totally fine. The challenge is sometimes is that there's pesky, persistent, potentially negative things that are what we might call dominant genes or persistent genes that can overwhelm something that you really love.
Mm,
And this is sometimes where people give up is that they encounter something that keeps creating a negative return, or they're like, geez, I keep selecting for this, but then two-thirds of the population is this other thing or other things that aren't as good. And that's where things like hand pollination and getting away from the gene pool model or the open pollinated model can come into work in your breeding program. So it's a bit of first you love the cross, first you're just trying to taste what's going on. Second, it's trying to understand what's your selection criteria and how your process is going to work in those later generations. And then it's a question of like, what is your goal? Is your goal a stable variety
mm,
that is always going to reproduce a very similar thing? Or are you okay with kind of the bobbing and weaving? Because the bobbing and weaving is great, but it requires ongoing selection, just like the stable thing requires ongoing selection. Because what happens is the bobbing and weaving part of things, left to its own devices, the persistent genes win. And so you don't it's really an ongoing thing. People have a belief that there's quote a finished variety. There's never any such thing. All these open pollinated varieties that most of us are used to, like Waltham butternut or whatever, originally were very selfed lines that were highly selected for anywhere from 6 to 20 generations, and they were released as a stable variety, maybe with a little bit of Goomba in the background, because there's always something in the background. Very quickly, those varieties turn into more diverse populations as soon as they are grown in an open pollinated way for a number of generations. So we have to recognize that even in the hybrid breeding, they maintain those parent lines. That's why the thing works the way it works. If they don't treat those parent lines in that way, then the hybrid is no longer consistent or stable in production of the traits. So we don't have a stopping point. And what it really then this is what breeding makes you realize is it often someone who's doing breeding has often discovers this, or maybe they're already doing variety maintenance and they realize that variety maintenance is breeding, is that that's kind of where we end up, is we kind of realize, is there a stopping point? And you have to decide for yourself where that is. Because you can keep selecting something for the rest of your life. And it may you would be the only one that would know what was going on, why it was getting better, or what the benefit of doing that would be, where everyone else was like, it's great. So, most of the time people in the hybrid breeding model will tell you that 5 to 7 generations of inbreeding just gets you a stable line or stable-ish line. In open pollinated work, we find it's 10 to 15 years or generations to get a relatively stable, where that means that 95 out of 100 plants are this thing. So just bear that in mind in your timeline or your goal.
do you think that there's value, I mean, in terms of a grower setting plant breeding goals and that quite long timeline for OP plant breeding, do you think that there's value in, or do you think that's part of the reason that this kind of land race sort of plant population management, like wider selections, has kind of come to the forefront a little bit? Like, is there, and are those wider selections more helpful in climate change than striving for a super consistent, quote unquote, finished variety?
I mean, that's a really good question. I think the answer is, again, like how you select. If somebody continues to select a population and they're really clear, not clear, but they're really engaged in that, we're looking at the plant, the flavor, the disease resistance, whatever it is, um, then that population can be hundreds of times better and more beneficial than a set variety. Because a breeder will say to you, who does this on the sort of whatever professional level, that they've basically already started on the next thing before that other variety is even finished. Like if it takes 7 years to or five, whatever, to finish the squash variety, they've already got something better that they're playing with. Or that they're interested in on the other end of that they've started on. So they're not thinking of these things as quote finished, that they're done breeding. They just have another product. And that's part of the product pipeline mentality around breeding. Whereas, like I was saying to my friends at the crabapple farm, like they breed some squash, and every time they find a new winter squash that they like, that they think is tasty and productive, whether it's a hybrid or OP, they might fold it into their existing
Mm,
population. And so I think the concept of stopping any project or stopping of, breeding, and this is like you hand it to somebody else and they play with it and they have their own favorites. And that's really what OPs basically are, is when you think about named varieties, you could have, you go back to our history books or our variety release books, and you'll see there's, I don't know, 100 white sweet corns from 1930 or something. And really, what it comes down to is probably half of those are somewhat related, or if not closely related, and they're just variations on a theme of someone selecting it for different traits. And so, really, most of these varieties are really just offshoots from what you might consider to be that diverse gene pool. So either you can work in that diverse gene pool mode, which oddly enough in the conventional breeding model has a name. They call it synthetics, which is a really weird name. And really what the word synthetic means is it's basically a population project where there's multiple parents creating basically an ongoing selected hybrid or an ongoing selected OP. It's a very weird name. I don't know why they came up with that. I think it has to do with the concept of like synthesizing multiple genes stacked on. But anyways, so the conventional version of this, of what we might call a gene pool breeding, or this other word landrace, they have this word they call synthetic, and that's the same thing. So that most of the plant breeding stuff that what people really love on the conventional plant breeding model is they love creating those synthetics and then selecting individual plants out of them. That's how they create, that's how a lot of breeders really like to create their inbred lines or their new things, is
mhm.
mixing a bunch of things up, and they call it recombinant crossing, which
Okay.
is a really silly word, but makes you think DNA and a lot of things. But they take every single hybrid that's legal to play with, and they create a big pool of them, and they let them cross, and then they're doing that work, but they have a fancy word that they put on that work. So don't get yourself wrong that advanced breeding for disease resistance and performance, most breeders think the gold standard is to create a massive gene pool and select strong, awesome plants out of it and create inbred lines diverging from that, but always maintaining some kind of strong, crazy pool that you're playing with. So we're being told that inbreds are the way to go, but inbreds diverge from something. Somebody is doing what they call pre-breeding. However, they get to the inbred line, that's kind of moot. It's the fact that there's actually this thing so the value of that obviously has value, or they wouldn't be doing it. So the answer is yes, it creates adaption. Yes, it creates unique market stuff that maybe you like, but maybe, you go to a watermelon size that I really like oval long watermelons. I'm a big fan of oval watermelons. You don't see elongated oval watermelons anymore in the store. I don't want huge ones. I can't grow the 50 pounders, but I like a nice, I don't know, I just like that size, that shape. And so, if I want that, then I have to either find those varieties, and cross some ones that are like short season with some of the ones that are long season and figure it out. And this is how all the stuff that we love was created. So to me, the joy of creation, I think, you fall in love with this process because who doesn't love watermelons? I mean, I mean, if you're having a watermelon tasting party as part of your farm or your whatever, your home life, like who hates you when you show up with watermelons to give away? So there's not really anything bad. I love playing like what I call, watermelon Santa Claus, where you like people are just like, wow, I love these watermelons. You're like, and they just think you're the greatest big person on earth because you have all these watermelons to give away. Meanwhile, you're doing this totally nerdy thing. And I think it's very addictive. So I think more just like, I think the caution is be careful. You could see yourself falling down and this sliding down this greased fireman's pole of breeding work because it's super fun.
Mm.
Nobody knows. So the farmers, I used to grow produce and like this is way more fun. Trust me. So the farmers who are growing produce who are watching this are going to be like, I got to stay just growing things. I'm not listening to this guy. But it's super fun. You should give it a shot. And the results are even the fact when you say something doesn't taste good, it's really interesting to be like, wow, this is a really bad tasting watermelon. Why is that? Or just like, that is in its own way, it's interesting, to discover how bad something can be, in my opinion. And maybe I mean, I don't want to save those things. It'd be really interesting if someone was selecting for really bad tasty things. But there's other things that come out of this which are really unique. I think folks probably know, or some folks might know this fellow David Katzel over in British Columbia, and their farm did a cross, I think, of like ornamental kale and Brussels sprouts,
That's right.
and
Yeah.
it's super cool. There's like
Select for
leaf
something
types,
opposite.
yeah. There's like leaf types and all kinds of weird stuff in there that you would never see. I grew out like 50 plants of it this year just on the farm just to see what I mean. I've never seen these are just, you know, some things your market would go crazy over. And I mean, if you're a market, and that's just something to remember that a lot of these folks that are doing this work, like the Frank Mortons, who everyone's like, Frank Morton lettuce. Frank Morton was selling diverse lettuce. This is what made him part of his work as a vet was a salad grower, mixed grower. He and Karen were able to market that. And so, you kind of go, okay, there's actually something here that sets us apart in the marketplace potentially. And I don't mean every project, but for an example, those tomatoes that I was talking about, the crabapple farm, everybody loves their tomatoes, so everyone goes there for their tomatoes, I'm sure, at the farmer's market, and they're well known for their tasty tomatoes. It's not like they breed everything. They're not like working on billion crops, but they've chosen this one thing as like their thing that they do.
Yeah. Yeah, we have the Kenobi carrot breeding project, and we have one farm, a neighbor of Stephen Owens, who's working on that. We went to her place on Sunday to do the carrot harvest and the tasting. And
Mhm.
we started joking about how we were going to start like an ugly and disgusting vegetables breeding project because some of those carrots were just like the most awful thing you could put in your mouth. It just they were terrible.
Yep.
And then its neighbor in the field, like, sweetest tasting, crispiest little carrot you've ever had. So it was really like tasting every single root was
Yep.
such an eye opener for me. I'd never done that before. Um, and it was, yeah, it was really fun.
It's fun. It's fun, and we realize that some of the gross tasting tomatoes, sometimes, sorry, carrots, are sometimes like have really great plant habit and really great, healthy tops. And you start to say, oh, this is like when you're creating a disease resistant population, for an example. Sometimes you cross something that's not so great with something that's really great because you're trying to get those healthy traits in. Like the wild traits are often not very tasty, or as I should say, healthy traits. Plant health doesn't always reflect palatability for human beings.
Hmm.
And so some of the balance of doing this breeding work is taking things that are gross, crossing them with things that are yummy. And that's how sometimes we get some really resilient, yummy things. But we have to be willing to, it's not always about crossing two things that taste good. There's been some ways. I'll just share another breeding project that I know some folks were doing, that they were breeding a watermelon out of a hybrid. So they were taking they had a hybrid and they really liked this hybrid, and the hybrid got dropped or the supply chain got broken or something. And they really loved that watermelon and they selected for what they thought, was the what was going on. And basically they lost the disease resistance because It's pretty easy to do that, but if you're not testing genetically for it, or if you don't have the disease in the field that year or for a couple of years, and then suddenly you do. So the powdery mildew or the fusarium resistance of the variety got lost. And so it tasted good, but the plants were like wilting down before they really even ripened. So that was affecting the quality of the fruit.
Yeah.
So what we kind of in reflection you realize is that hybrid was probably the a cross between a very tasty heirloom or a very tasty breeding line that didn't have any disease resistance and something that was medium tasty or not crossed with that had the disease resistance. So something that was weak crossed with something that was strong in terms of disease resistance, and that yields the hybrid that's generally tasty and disease resistance. And they had selected for flavor only and had basically kind of more selected for those things that were coming out of it that were the kind of more towards the heirloomy sweet parent. And
Mhm.
so so their next question was, okay, what's a good tasty OP? They wanted to cross it with another open pollinated variety that has disease resistance. So there's some varieties out of the South that are, in the old days, I used to just breed OPs. There's one called Mickey Lee. There's a bunch of other ones um, that have the word Lee in them, but also some other ones from Texas and Alabama. And there's one that was about this size, this sort of the similar size, and they crossed that, and now they're seeing the disease resistance. So they kind of basically kind of diverged from their original breeding project
Mhm.
to kind of do something different. So those are the types of challenges that um, you're likely to come across and have to make decisions about. And in their case, they decided to kind of leap forward into the unknown and cross it with something else because they were reaching this bottleneck. I think some folks might have given up at that point and said, this is becoming not a good thing. So this is where they had asked somebody, we're having this problem. And this is why it's good to ask people and to read things and to have a community of other breeders and other growers that you are in communication with, because you can come up against the bottleneck and you might be the only person that's ever seen that, but it's very likely that someone else who's also played with that crop or some other crop similar has also encountered this and has a strategy. So going it on your own is great. And then if you really want to make success, you sometimes have to ask. And you have to ask for directions sometimes. So sometimes our public breeders are great resources, are people who are working for state sponsored land grant universities who are doing research or doing plant breeding. Some of those folks are great and share everything they know and will give you some tips or connect you with somebody. And then sometimes you have to reach out into the stratosphere to see if there's someone else who's working with watermelon who might understand why things went wrong. And also, honestly, 99% of the time, it's a because everyone else is struggling in that same space, they're usually happy to share. Even some of the professional breeders who are supposed to not share with you sometimes will be like, well, I can't really tell you what to do, but there's this you know, begins with this letter and ends with this letter and is sold by this company and go find it. So,
Yeah.
so they may give you I encountered that and I did this thing, and they'll kind of give you like a hint, and you just have to like realize that they're giving you a hint and not like, shrug your shoulders. So, it's a really valuable, I think that, is it economically valuable in terms of like, is there benefit to sell the finished variety? Seed companies have been trying to solve this for a long time. So I can't tell you that you breed something and it's perfect and it's tasty and it's disease resistant and that equals X dollar signs. We could spend a whole another session about what does it mean to bring something into commercial market and whether and the economics around that. And that's a great thing. And like I said, I have in the past when I was selling produce, this whole thing was like a signature of my farm.
Mm.
Mixed breeder melon cases. Everybody loved them. They were just like, comes out of this breeding field. And they were like, it's like 10 different flavors in a box. They couldn't get enough of it.
So
And,
great.
and
Yeah.
it was great. I could sell all these, half cases or full cases of melons I wanted. So in that sense, the breeding part was an economic boost. Are the finished varieties an economic boost? Eh, you know, that's a good question.
Mm,
But I think that, people discover that you're playing with something and they're going to try your stuff, particularly if you've kind of exposed them to your stuff. And the people who are in your region are going to be the people that are exposed to your stuff. So just imagine that you're going to have this meetup. I know that this is part of this thing. Just imagine that every year, anyone who's breeding something is brave enough to come and have other people sample their stuff and give input. And then you get to be known as people that are playing with fun things. And people are curious every year about what your fun thing is. And it could be one for, summer crops and one for storage crops. Or,
yeah.
so like your
Mhm.
carrot thing you're talking about, So if there was 3 or 4 people working on winter squash, you could have a little fun tasting thing that happens in the middle of the winter. So that type of thing, it's hard because someone might be like, this is gross. But it's also just kind of like, I think when people know in the spirit in which it's being offered, it becomes like a really fun thing.
Yeah.
And
Really good learning.
yeah. So that could be a way. I think it's like if the community, a way to expose the community to your work, whether it's your CSA, whether it's your farmers market, whether it's your neighbors, whether it's your sort of, larger regional community through these types of gatherings. There's lots of ways where this is beneficial. And I think economically beneficial. Yes. Finished varieties, next episode.
Absolutely. So wonderful. I've taken an hour of your time, just about. I made little notes of things that I learned for myself in this video, and I'm really looking forward to rewatching it and figuring out how to um, how to use this content to support folks in the plant breeding discussion that we're going to have at the end of November. You are so it's just a delight to chat with you, Heron. It really is. Yeah.
People say this, sometimes. Other
It's
times,
not just
other
planners.
times they say other things. But it's always fun, It's always like it's hard to communicate the tip of the iceberg of really wonderful, fun work.
Yeah.
Because I think a lot of times it seems kind of complicated and daunting, and other times, it's like you're worried you're going to get confused and misdirected. It's like all those things are true, but again, it comes down to I have 2 things I like, or more than 2 things. What happens if I play with these things? Or what's even more fun is sometimes you are just buying seed and you discover something random because there was an outcross in that seed production. And you go, whoa, this is cool. And how do you save seed from that and maybe play with it going forward? And I mean, those 2 things are about like 95% of where people who are doing plant breeding start. Chance things they stumble across that
Hmm.
are accidents,
Hmm.
or wondering, geez, I really like, sunshine squash from Johnny's, and I really like, this other kabocha. What happens if I cross these 2 together? And next thing you know, you've got this really yummy thing. So, um, the answer of like, is it easy? It's easy. Is it complicated? Yeah. You remember when you first were learning to tie your shoes and that was like an impossible thing? It's kind of like that, and then like someone, maybe you've tied your shoes and then later in life someone says, hey, you want to try something called knitting? You know, crossing 2 things and playing with them is like tying your shoes, kind of complicated at first. And then there's this other thing called knitting that maybe you discover after a couple of years of tying your shoes. So that's that's where it is. Now you tie your shoes all the time and you don't even think about it. So, I think that's and the joy of having nicely tied shoes. So that's like kind of the joy of plant breeding is when someone says, "This is good." And you're like, "Yeah." And they're like, "Where'd you get this?" "Well, we're breeding it on our farm." Oh, next thing you know, you're kind of like a local sort of minor character that the story goes, well, he or she or they were breeding some stuff on their farm. It was kind of cool.
Hmm.
So anyways, best of luck with the with this conference, and I really appreciate everybody in the Atlantic Canada community, and
Take good care. We'll talk again.
okay, take care.
Okay, bye, Karen.